Well, hey, you guys. Welcome back to the salon. Long time no see. So, before I start embarking on the long trek into season 2 of Thriller with Boris Karloff, which, if you're new here, I've been covering it for, the last several months or whatever, and I've been doing like 6 episodes at a time, and I just finished season 1. However, if you remember a couple months back or something like that, I said that I was going to kind of go off on a little side tangent into maybe Night Gallery because I ended up watching the pilot episode and doing a video about that. And it just so happened that a couple weekends ago, I was kind of like out and about. And I happened upon a complete box set of all 3 seasons of Rod Serling's Night Gallery, and it was priced very reasonably. So I went ahead and bought it and started watching it, thinking maybe this was, again, a message from the universe saying it's like, hey, remember how you said that you were going to like go off and do Night Gallery also? Maybe you should start doing that. I will do what the universe wants me to do, like sometimes, like within certain parameters, I guess. So when I first started out, because I was like, well, I don't really know how many episodes I'm going to be talking about at a time. Because like I said, on Thriller, I usually do 6 episodes unless there's some other thing going on. But what I decided to do, I said, well, I'll just sit down and watch as many episodes as I watch without, worrying about it. And it turned out that season 1, like aside from the pilot, which I already covered, was actually only 6 episodes anyway. So I said, well, shit, I might as well just go ahead and do all of season 1. Which actually comprised, because if you don't know, Night Gallery usually had at least 2 stories, like in one episode, which were 48 minutes or an hour long or whatever. Some of them had 3. But so the first season, like those 6 episodes, actually comprised 17 stories altogether. So that's what we're going to be talking about on today's video. So hopefully, go get a cup of coffee, settle in, because this is going to take a while. So episode 1, the first story is called The Dead Man. And I have to say, this is probably my favorite of all of the episodes that I've watched so far, which is all of season 1, because I kind of feel like it's the most macabre, because I will kind of say, just like right out of the gate, even though Night Gallery does have the reputation of being kind of more horror focused than, say the Twilight Zone, like Rod Serling's other show, I have to admit that a lot of the stories on Night Gallery were maybe not as creepy as people might remember them, and a lot of them were very Twilight Zone-y, which is not, it's no ding against it, and it's not that surprising either, because Rod Serling also wrote a bunch of Twilight Zone episodes, and, it was a lot of the same author crossover, so yeah, you're going to get a lot of the same kind of stuff. But The Dead Man, like I said, was kind of more horror focused, I guess, being sort of focused around a mad scientist. Now, this story was actually based on a short story by famed horror and fantasy writer Fritz Leiber, or Leiber. I'm pretty sure it's Leiber, but if I pronounce it wrong, I apologize. But it also kind of gave me definite vibes of the Edgar Allan Poe story, The Facts in the Case of M. Valdemar. This was actually directed by Douglas Hayes, which I think is how you pronounce his last name. Now, I've actually brought him up several times, like over in my Thriller breakdowns, because he directed a bunch of those episodes as well. So like I said, you're getting a lot of crossover, because these were like all the people working in anthology TV around this time. So you're going to see the same names turning up, like of all of these anthology shows. Incidentally, speaking of Douglas Hayes, I think I mentioned this before, like when I talked about him on Thriller, but I just wanted to mention again that if you didn't know, he actually directed the movie Kitten with a Whip with Anne Margaret and John Forsythe, which I've actually seen a bunch of times on MST3K, so I just thought I would bring that up once again because I think that's kind of neat. So anyway, The Dead Man starts out with this one doctor whose name is Miles Talmadge, and he's played by Jeff Corey. He actually directed a segment from an episode that I'm going to be talking about later on. So his character is coming to visit another doctor whose name is Max Redford at his kind of swanky mansion experimental medical facility kind of deal. I'm not really sure what it is. So Dr. Talmadge, when he comes in there, he kind of wonders, hey, Dr. Redford, where did all of your other patients go? Because I guess it was like a sanatorium type of situation. And Dr. Redford says, oh, I'm only working with one patient these days, but holy crap, is he a doozy. So this patient, it turns out, is this very tanned, golden-haired young man whose name is John Fearing. Now, he's played by Michael Blodgett, who I recognized from yet another MST3K classic, Catalina Caper. He was in a bunch of other stuff too, but that's where I immediately recognized him from. He was in Beyond the Valley of the Dolls, as a matter of fact. So John Fearing, he's laying on this gurney in Dr. Redford's laboratory, and when Dr. Talmadge gets there, and he looks kind of sick, and he's like looks like he's like unconscious or sedated or something like that. So Dr. Redford is kind of like smirking at his colleague there, and he asked Dr. Talmadge, "Hey, I want you to look at this patient and diagnose his condition." So Dr. Talmadge looks over there and he said, I don't remember what the disease he said was, but he was just like, yeah, it's this or that or whatever. And Dr. Redford is still kind of smirking, and he's like, nope, that's not what it is. And actually then when Dr. Talmadge like turns around to look at the patient again, the dude is like completely healthy. Like all of his symptoms have disappeared. So Dr. Redford actually ends up fucking with his colleague a few more times like this, like making him guess, like, hey, what disease is this now? Like, guess the disease kind of game. Because this patient, Fearing, is seemingly manifesting like completely different diseases, like pretty much at the drop of a hat, which is weird, right? I mean, it's very strange. And then, so after this back and forth a few times, Fearing gets up from the gurney and he's totally fine, totally healthy looking, and just kind of swans out of the room like to go get dressed for dinner. So Dr. Redford then explains what's going on because, you know, Dr. Talmadge at this point is like pretty mystified. So he says, what I've been doing, like working with this one guy, he's like, essentially, I can hypnotize him because he has like some kind of genetic predisposition to, you know, be susceptible to this type of thing, apparently, into pretty much just like physically exhibiting the symptoms of any disease that is suggested to him by the doctor. Now, obviously, if you have somebody that can do this, like this could have tremendous medical significance, or at least so the doctor thinks. Matter of fact, Dr. Redford is so certain that this finding, this experiment that he's doing, is going to just change the world and make his reputation, that he will do absolutely anything to hang on to this guy, this prize patient, right? Now, this includes letting Fearing bang his wife, whose name is Velia, because Velia has actually fallen for the guy. Because, you know, her husband's a doctor, he's in his lab all the time, and she's probably getting a little bit lonely, you know what I mean? So here's this kind of young, studly motherfucker, like, wandering around, and she's like, yeah, I'm gonna get me a piece of that. And so, like, the doctor knows about it, but he's just kind of like, well, I don't want him to leave, and I don't like it going on, but you know what I mean? So it's just kind of like a funny situation going around. So dinner that evening, a little bit awkward, as you might imagine. So, previous to Dr. Talmadge arriving, Dr. Redford had been curious to see if this revolutionary method that he's developing could even transcend death. So he started doing like a series of experiments where he would basically hypnotize Fearing into being dead and then apparently successfully return him to being alive again just by giving him the post-hypnotic suggestion or whatever. However, when Dr. Redford attempts to replicate this experiment while Dr. Talmadge is there, because he's like, I gotta show you this shit, this is crazy, something goes terribly wrong, as it would. And this is possibly, it's hinted, because Dr. Redford's kind of latent jealousy about, you know, his wife and Fearing fucking is kind of causing him to subconsciously sabotage his own experiment, like, in a way. So, as I mentioned, this, like I said, this is probably my favorite of season 1. I mean, there's kind of 2 in the running, but this is a really good one. It's really fun. I mean, it doesn't really offer any surprises. You pretty much know kind of like in the ballpark of what's going to happen. But it's a pretty great premise, and it had like a pretty grim ending, which I really liked. I really also liked the introduction of Dr. Redford's kind of unconscious subversion of his own experiment. I thought that was a nice touch. Because it kind of gave his character a little bit more depth and a little bit more, like, you were maybe a little bit more sympathetic. Not hugely sympathetic, because still, this was some fucked up shit he was doing. But you did feel like, yes, he's a mad scientist, you know, in those terms, but on some level, he did kind of feel a deep sense of guilt about what he was doing to this guy, and also he was uncertain of his own motives, and he was like willing to question. He's like, holy shit, you know, am I really that upset about, you know, my wife fucking this guy that I would, you know, subconsciously like fuck the experiment up so he'll actually die, you know what I mean? So I thought that was kind of like a cool like layer that they added to it. So yeah, that was a very solid story to start the series out on, for sure. So the second story in episode 1 is called The Housekeeper. Now this one kind of like more juvenile and funny than scary. I mean, it's like not scary at all, but it's still pretty entertaining. So The Housekeeper was written by the former story's director, Douglas Hayes, under his pseudonym that he used all the time, which was Matthew Howard. And it was directed by John Meredith Lucas, who actually did a bunch of original Star Trek episodes and a bunch of, like, a ton of other TV. Like, if you go to his Wikipedia page, it's like a fucking long thing. And kind of like the first story, these were kind of thematically linked a little bit. This one also kind of revolves around a mad scientist, sort of. Although this one's kind of more like on the black magic alchemy kind of end, but still he has a lab and all that. So J.R. Ewing himself, Larry Hagman, is in this one. And he's kind of like this black magic enthusiast guy, if you want to call him that, named Cedric. Now, at the start of the tale, he calls an agency to send him a housekeeper. And one of his specifications is basically make sure she's a real woofer. Like, pretty much. He's like, I want a woman that no one else wants. Okay? So that's what he says. So, turns out that the agency has just the thing. We have this woman that we keep around for just such assignments. Even though nobody wants her and she never gets any work, we just, like, keep her on reserve, just in case anybody calls with this very specific request. So, yeah. So who this woman is, it's this very little, like, kind-hearted, but kind of a little bit funny-looking, like, little old lady named Miss Waddle. Now, Miss Waddle is played by Jeanette Nolan, and they actually, like, kind of uglied her up for the role, obviously. And they also put this weird, it looked like they put a weird spacer thing, like, under her upper lip, I guess, so it made her look even more weird or, like, unattractive or whatever. Because, like I said, she's supposed to be ugly. She's not ugly, but they're supposed to make her, like, funny looking, you know what I mean? So, yeah, so why does Cedric want an ugly old housekeeper, you might be wondering. Here's the deal. Cedric is married to this completely gorgeous and very wealthy woman named Carlotta. Which, you know, all well and good, you might think, but Carlotta is a real cold-hearted bitch. I mean, at least according to Cedric, who maybe is, like, not the best judge. Although she does act, like, pretty bitchy, like, over the course of the thing, but you don't know what was going on, like, prior, you know what I mean? Like, maybe she, like, didn't act like that before, but putting up with his shit was just kind of, like, too much. Just, like, whatever the edge. You know what I mean? I'm willing to give her the benefit of the doubt. So she's a stone cold bitch, and she's also been kind of, like, making noises about maybe divorcing Cedric's mystical ass and taking her massive fortune right along with her. Now, obviously, this is something that Cedric, who does not appear to have a job or any marketable skills at all, he's just can't abide that, right? So he has figured out a way that involves frogs, don't ask too many questions about it, to essentially, like, transfer one person's, like, entire personality, their soul, their identity, if you want to call it that, into another body. Like he can switch personalities and bodies, pretty much. So now that you have that kind of laid out, so that's why he has this ugly old housekeeper. So he starts whining and dining poor little Miss Waddle, kind of tempting her with, you know, just think about all of the confidence and power and money that you'll have when your, you know, lovely, pure-hearted soul is just ensconced inside the beautiful form of Carlotta, who, like I said, is beautiful on the outside, but, like, ugly on the inside. Now, eventually, I mean, Miss Waddle is pretty reluctant, I mean, as you would be. But she does kind of, like, succumb to the wheedling after a while. She's like, yeah, it kind of would be nice to just, like, walk around and have everybody look at me, like, with something other than pity for a change. You know what I mean? You get it. Using frog magic, which, like I said, just kind of roll with it, her identity is transferred into Carlotta. And then Carlotta's, you know, cunty identity is stuck in Miss Waddle's little dumpling of a body, that Cedric then, he doesn't kill her, but he just, like, drugs her into unconsciousness, I guess, just so she's kind of, like, out of the way. Now, predictably, and almost immediately, you knew this was gonna happen, Cedric, who's pretty diabolical, I gotta say, he, let's put it this way, claims husbandly dominion over Miss Waddle. Even though she is obviously a completely different person who just happens to inhabit the shell of his legal wife, you know what I mean? That's not the same person. She just looks the same on the outside. But he just figures, hey, you're married to me, so loophole, you know what I mean? So I get rights to, like, fuck you. So wisely, yeah, Miss Waddle is like, yeah, I don't like that at all. Which, you know, go Miss Waddle. She locks herself in her room and won't come out for like 3 days. You know what I mean? She's, like, not having it. You know, because she's, like, you know, Cedric's roving penis is, like, hovering around out there, and she's just like, I don't want any part of that. So, yeah, she just stays in her room. So then there's, like, a couple more kind of switcheroos, like, people going back and forth. Like, they get another ugly housekeeper in there. It's a whole thing. And then, like, the story, I have to say it kind of, like, fizzles out. into a sort of like unresolved finish. This one didn't have a hugely satisfying ending. I mean, honestly, here's what I thought. I've seen all of these before, but it's been many, many, many years. I think the last time I watched the whole series was probably like 13 years ago, something like that. So I don't actually remember like how a lot of them ended. So how I thought this was going to end was I thought that Cedric's personality was going to be accidentally transferred somehow into like one of the frogs, because they kept bringing the frogs up, and frogs don't have anything specific to do with the story, so I just thought that was going to happen. I mean, that would have been awesome. Not so much fun for the frog, I guess, but yeah. But as it turns out, Cedric, this fucking douche, doesn't even really get punished for all the shit that he did. And what's more, it's implied that this actually isn't the first time that he's put this ugly old woman's quote-unquote nicer personality into his hot wife's body. Which raises the question, at least to me, why is Carlotta still sticking around? Like, I know she said at the beginning that she was going to divorce his ass, but like, she's the one with all the money. Like, I don't see what she sees in him. Like, why she would, especially if he was doing like experimenting on her and stuff and she knew about it. And also, why wasn't she suspicious when Cedric brought Miss Waddle home? Oh, this is the new quote-unquote housekeeper. And she's like, yeah, I've heard that song and dance before. You know what I mean? Like, she didn't do that. So really, all I could think of, man, I'm thinking about this too much, I guess, but all I could think of was like, maybe Carlotta is into this, and maybe this is like her and Cedric's kink, you know? Like, switching bodies out. You know what I mean? It's the whole thing. I mean, no judgment if that's the case. Though, I will note that it would probably be best not to involve innocent domestics like in your weird sex games. So, just pro tip. So like I said, this one, again, not so much a horror story. It's kind of like a mean-spirited attempt at like a comical morality tale. So, after the first one, it was a little bit of a letdown, but it is like still, entertaining enough, I guess. So episode 2. The first story is called Room with a View. And this is a very, very brief story taking place pretty much like entirely in one room. So this one was actually adapted by Hal Dresner from his own short story and was directed by Gerald Friedman. Also, this one features a very young Diane Keaton, which in what I think was only her second TV appearance. I think she was also on Love American Style, like the same year that this came out, which I think was 1970. But yeah, so she's like cute as a button in this. So you got this cranky old dude named Mr. Bauman, and he's just this bedridden invalid. He has like I don't think they say like what his disease is, but he can't get out of bed, like pretty much. So seemingly the only bright spot in his drab existence is this perky nurse that comes to see him, like who's Diane Keaton. Her name is Frances, and she's really sweet and nice and comes and talks to him and takes care of him and stuff. And she also happens to be dating the hunky family chauffeur whose name is Vic. So Frances is all about Vic, man, and she's like even talking about them getting married and all this other kind of stuff. However, what she doesn't know is that Vic has also been playing hide the sausage with Mr. Bauman's young and beautiful wife, Lila. Now, Mr. Bauman actually knows about all of this stuff because he's been watching his wife and Vic like canoodling through binoculars from his upstairs window, because he's one of those, like I said, it's kind of like a rear window type of situation. Now, since Mr. Bauman is bedridden and he can't get revenge for his wife's faithlessness on his own behalf, he kind of callously, I have to say, decides that he's going to use his little innocent nurse, Frances, as essentially his unwitting trigger man, is what he's going to do. So he's looking out his binoculars one day and sees his wife and Vic like disappearing into Vic's living quarters for, presumably a little bit of afternoon delight or whatever. So Bauman, very casually, he goes into like his, his bedside table, and he pulls this little pistol out, and he's like, hey, he gives it to Frances and just very innocently tells her, hey, why don't you take this over to Vic's place? Like, he needs to clean this for me. You know what I mean? And, because it had been set up earlier that Frances was like kind of the jealous type, and she's like, man, if I saw Vic with another woman or something like that, like I would just go crazy. And he's just like, oh, I'm glad you said that. So yeah, so he gives her this gun and said, hey, go over to Vic's place right now. You know what I mean? And then like basically you just don't see anything else. You're just like watching him in bed, and like you hear a gunshot, and that's like pretty much the end of it. So yeah, so like I said, there's really not much to the story, and it's definitely not horror, but I mean the interactions between Frances and Mr. Bauman are still good enough that that I would probably still recommend this one. Although, like I said, it's pretty insubstantial overall because it's like really, really short. So the second story on episode 2 is called The Little Black Bag. Now, this is one that was kind of strange and a little bit convoluted. So this one was actually written by Rod Serling himself, and has all of the kind of flowery wording that his scripts were known for, and was directed by someone whose name I'm sure I'm going to pronounce wrong, but Gino Schwark, who also directed Jaws 2, Somewhere in Time, and Supergirl. So there's that. So in this one, there's kind of like a little bit of a prologue, which is sort of set in this very sparse, supposed to be like futuristic looking office in the year 2098. And this guy, who's like, it's apparently some hapless office worker, is telling someone over the phone, who you presume is his boss, that a medical bag accidentally got sent back in time to 1971. And they have to go through the protocols to kind of get it back or destroy it, like, before anything untoward happens. You know what I mean? Like, we can't have like people in 1971 seeing all this 2098 technology. It'll cause butterfly effect, yada yada. So we then get transported to what was then the present day of 1971. Now, Burgess Meredith is in this, and he plays a drunken bum who also happens to be a former doctor named Dr. William Fall. Now, he's buddied up with another bum who's this very hilariously like gravel-voiced hobo named Hepplewhite. And he's played by an actor named Chill Wills. Yeah, that's his name. He was in a shit ton of Westerns back in the day. He's been a fuck ton of stuff. He was just in so much stuff. Just among other things. But he was known for being like in Westerns. But he has like this real gravelly kind of voice. Now, as it happens, Dr. Fall finds this time-traveling medical bag in a trash can. And he immediately realizes the significance of it. Now, at first, despite him knowing how important it is, him and Hepplewhite are actually just going to hawk it, to like get a few bucks to spend on some MD 2020 or whatever. But while they're in the pawn shop, this very desperate woman spots the bag and thinks he's a doctor, which, I mean, technically he is a doctor, but and she kind of like comes up to him and said, please, can you come to my place and like look at my daughter? She's very sick and I can't really afford a doctor and I don't know what to do, and blah, blah, blah. So Dr. Fall goes along to this woman's house. Now, Hepplewhite is just grumbling the whole time because he's like, man, we could have had $8 from that fucking $8 whole. I mean, I know that was more money in 1971 than it is now, but yeah, $8 for like, for the medical bag from the pawn shop. So he's like griping about that the whole time. But after Dr. Fall goes to the apartment and successfully cures this little girl, she had like pneumonia or something like that, using kind of these miraculous doodads that were in the bag, he decides, kind of gets a new lease on life. He decides, you know what, I'm going to get my shit together and I'm going to use all this stuff inside like for the betterment of mankind because this shit's amazing. So on his kind of like do-gooding crusade, he goes back to the homeless shelter where they've been staying and he fixes one old man's like rheumatoid arthritis and completely cures another guy there like of his terminal cancer. Like, and he's getting up, running around, go, woo, it's a miracle, you know what I mean? So after this, after he knows like how all the stuff in the bag works, because there's handily instructions in there, he decides he's going to kind of organize this little conference and he's going to speak to kind of all of the leading lights of the medical community about all the different ways that the technology that's in this bag is going to help the human race and how they can expand on it and stuff like that. Hepplewhite, though, is not fucking having it. He's very, very greedy, and he's just like, I'm not down with all this liberal helping people bullshit. So when Dr. Fall won't go along with his money-grubbing agenda, he's like, we just want to go to the pawn shop and, like, get $8 to buy some fucking booze with. You know what I mean? So basically, he just straight up kills the doctor and impersonates him at the lecture. Like, he still goes to the lecture, and because he's like, well, maybe now I can make all the money. You know what I mean? I'm going to pretend I'm a doctor. By this time, though, unfortunately for him, the future people, because remember the bag came from the future and they were talking about that, they've actually zeroed in on the bag's location. You'd think like in 2098 they would have had like a fucking, you know what I mean? Like a tracker of that shit. But and they should have found it like instantly, because you could now, you know what I mean? Much less like years and years in the future. But yeah, so Hepplewhite had actually planned to do this demonstration, which was actually Dr. Fall was going to do it, because one of the things that was in the bag was like a scalpel. I think it was like a scalpel that only cut what you wanted it to cut. So you couldn't like cut things accidentally, you know what I'm saying? So Dr. Fall was like, oh, when I give the presentation, he's like, I'm going to say to the doctors, it's like, what do you think would happen if I took the scalpel and like stuck it right in my fucking jugular vein or whatever? And he's like, and then it wouldn't do it because it's not calibrated to that. So So Hepplewhite is going to do this, is going to replicate this experiment. However, because the future people have figured out where the bag is, and they're like, okay, well, we need to destroy that, like, real quick, or, like, make it not work anymore. So, like, right when he stabs himself in the neck, this shit doesn't work anymore. So all the doctors are coming out going, what the fuck was that all about? That dude just came in and just, like, stabbed himself in the neck and, like, killed himself in front of it. And it's just funny because the doctors are just kind of, like, so... They're not even, like, scandalized or they're not horrified by it, really. They're just like, what the hell was that all about? Like, I can't believe this dude got us out of fucking... took us away from our busy practices or whatever to just come here and, like, stab himself in the neck in front of us. What a loser. You know what I mean? It was just that kind of attitude, which really made me laugh. So, yeah, this one was, like, a pretty fun little sci-fi story. Have to say that it was bolstered significantly by... just great performances by Burgess Meredith. Burgess Meredith is always great. And Chill Wills, I mean, he is just a fucking hoot in this. He is just so fucking funny. I mean, he just goes all in on this evil bum character. You know what I mean? He's got that gravelly voice, and he's just like this funny, just like way of phrasing things. And sometimes he'll just stand there like with his mouth hanging open. It's just like fucking crazy. And it's just, he's just like a fucking blast. I fucking loved him in this. But yeah, I mean, this whole thing, it's kind of a bizarre premise, frankly. And I don't know. I don't know if I'm totally on board with the ending. I kind of liked it, but then there was some stuff I didn't like about it as well. But I think this was like a pretty good outing. But again, like not scary in the least. So not really a horror story, more like a science fiction story. A lot of these, like I said, had like a more morality tale type of thing, just like a lot of the Twilight Zone episodes did. So the third story in episode 2 is called The Nature of the Enemy. Now this one, a little bit less successful, let's say that. This one was a really short one, and it had a completely what the fuck premise. I mean, seriously, someone must have come up with this while they were high as balls. And that someone, again, was Rod Serling, because he was the one that wrote the teleplay. So this was directed by Alan Reisner. So we're following the progress of a failed lunar expedition. So there's like scientists at NASA, and they're just obviously like completely baffled about the disappearance of like this first set of astronauts that they sent up there. So perhaps unwisely, they're like, well, let's send another group of astronauts up there to see what the hell happened to the first people. You know what I mean? And you know, that's never a good idea in movies. So when the rescue dudes get there, though, like all they can see is this weird structure on the moon's surface that was clearly built by, like, out of equipment and material that the first astronauts had with them. You know what I mean? There's also at some point your standard kind of fuzzy transmission of one of the rescue astronauts, like, looking kind of aghast at something off screen and yelling something like, what is that? You know what I mean? And then, like, the picture dissolves into static, and all the NASA guys are standing around going, well, that's probably not good. So, yeah, so the NASA guys are, like, standing around looking at footage of the structure, like, from the ship that they sent. And I said aloud, I'm sitting there watching it, and I said aloud, I said, that looks just like a mousetrap. And the second after that was out of my mouth, like a character in the thing said the same thing. That looks like a mousetrap. And I was like, oh, called it. Okay, that's what it is. So yeah, spoiler alert. This episode could have been called Giant Mousies on the Moon. That's really what it is. You know, which... okay, I don't really know. Now, the ending appearance of one of said giant mousies, which, you know, the mouse was cute as a button, by the way. It kind of gave me some Night of the Lepus vibes, which is about giant bunny rabbits, if you haven't seen it. Yeah, kind of a record scratch moment. I have to be honest with you there, because what a random-ass idea. It's just a random-ass idea. It didn't even occur to me, really, like, where the concept for this could have possibly come from until Tom, who was watching some of them with me, and he said, oh, is it because the moon's made of cheese? Like, you know, that's the little story about it. And I was like, shit, you're probably right. And then it's like, when he said that, like, I actually heard that loser wah, wah, wah horn, like, in my head. I didn't do it out loud, but it's like, I heard it in my head. I was like, fuck. I was like, fuck, man. Crack a window. You know what I mean? I mean, shit. Okay, so, like, not the proudest moment in the series, like I said. Just fucking giant mice on the moon, like, what the fuck? Okay. I still love Rod Serling, but I was like, that is a stupid idea. So, episode 3. Now, episode 3 was much better, like, all around. Like, all the stories were good. And the first one was called The House. And, yeah, the two stories that were in this were actually, like, spooky and supernatural, which I really dug. So, The House, I think, is my second favorite, like, of all the episodes in season 1. And I like it because it's really ambiguous. It's very dreamlike. It's very atmospheric, which, you know, I usually like horror like that, that's not super concrete, but it's just kind of like eerie or it's just like unsettling. And this one's kind of like that. So Rod Serling also wrote this one, but it was adapted from a short story by Andre Maurois. I don't know. My French is like really bad. I used to take it in high school, but I can't do it anymore. And this one, interestingly, was directed by Gomez Addams himself. That's right, John Astin. This was actually his television directing debut, as far as I'm aware. So this story starts out with this beautiful young woman named Elaine, who's played by Joanna Patet or Patet, I'm not really sure. I actually recognized her from the very underrated 1978 haunted house movie, The Evil. If you haven't seen that, I recommend it. Now, she's preparing to be discharged from a very pleasant stay, it seems like, at a sanitarium she's been staying at. So she's telling her psychiatrist about a recurring dream that she's been having for like the last decade. Like she's had this all the time. Now, she insists it's not a nightmare, and she's like, it's not scary or anything like that. And she's like, actually, it's quite the opposite. It's quite like peaceful and quite serene. So in the dream, she says, she's driving in her convertible in slow motion. Like she has her beautiful long hair just like blowing behind her in the wind. Now, she's driving through this area, and even though she's never been in this area before, she somehow knows to go down this particular kind of secluded road, and it leads to this house that she feels like really super drawn to. So she goes up to the front door of the house and knocks on it, but nobody answers. And then after a little bit, like she gets back in her car and drives away. But then she tells the doctor that the front door of the house, like even though she can't see it, obviously like in real life you wouldn't be able to see it, but like in a dream, like, you know, that stuff's going on. So she's like, so while she's leaving and like going around the corner of the driveway, the long driveway, the front door like opens just a crack, like just as she's leaving the house behind. So not long after leaving the hospital or the sanitarium or whatever it is, Elaine finds herself driving down a road, and she just starts getting this very slowly dawning sense of deja vu. And naturally, you know, it's going to happen. She ends up finding the house from her dream because she starts recognizing like everything around her. She's like, oh my God, I'm going to go down this road. And she sees the house like exactly as she imagined it. So she kind of like stands in the driveway, like marveling, oh my God, here it is in real life and it looks exactly the same. And then she gets approached by this real estate agent, and he tells her that the house is for sale. Now, she wants to go inside and have a look around, and even though in the dream she only saw the exterior of the house, like when she gets inside, she still knows like exactly where everything is. So the agent tells her that the house is like super, super cheap. I think it's only like $60,000, which was, yeah, a lot in seven, but it's a big, huge house. You know what I mean? Like, and it's really nice. So that would have been cheap for back then. It's cheap because it's like, supposedly it's haunted, but like not in a crazy like Amityville horror kind of way. Like the walls don't bleed or nothing like that. Like no one got murdered in there. You know, it's not that kind of haunting. It's just, you know, kind of eerie. Is all it is. And the agent kind of implies that he's like, well, I kind of think that the previous owners might have just maybe been imagining the haunting or psychologically creating it, he says. So Elaine pretty much basically, she's like, I'm going to buy the place like right now, which is crazy. I'm like, holy crap, you just have like $60,000, right? Or at least like a down payment on $60,000. Hey, here you go. Even though she's been in a sanitarium for who knows how long. Maybe she comes from a wealthy family. I don't know. I worry about these kind of things. Now, shortly after moving in, she's taking a nap in the house one afternoon, and she hears a knock on the front door. Gosh, who do you think that might be? So in slow motion, she does a lot of stuff in slow motion, actually. She very elegantly, like, descends the staircase, but by the time she opens the door a crack, whoever was at the door is gone, which, you know, you kind of saw that coming. Now, all she can see is, like, the tail end of a convertible, kind of, like, rounding the corner of the driveway, like the long driveway. And then she calls her psychiatrist basically and says that she's figured out that she is the ghost. So yeah, like this episode was always one of the main ones that I remembered from the series, like when I watched it back in the day. Even though, I mean, it's not overtly scary. Nothing's like creepy. It doesn't take place at night. It's like all very sunlit and pastoral and everything like that. But it's just unsettling, you know what I mean? It's just, and I really like the kind of mood that it evokes, and I really love these kind of circular narratives where you're kind of unsure if the protagonist is actually alive or not, or do they exist or not, or is everything in their heads or what. Like they don't really tell you. Like, nothing is really explained, but it doesn't need to be. I think that's kind of what made the story make such an impact on me. I know that I've seen like some other reviews of this particular episode, and the people didn't really like it because they're just like, well, I didn't really know what was going on, or it seemed like it wasn't creepy or nothing happened. But it's like this kind of stuff is like creepier to me than more overtly scary stuff. So yeah, this is probably it's kind of in the top contention between it's this one and the Dead Man are probably my favorite ones, and maybe it's a tie, I'm not really sure. So the second story on this episode is called Certain Shadows on the Wall, and this is another ghost story, but kind of a slightly more traditional one. So this was written by again Rod Serling, even though it was adapted from a short story called The Shadows on the Wall by Mary E. Wilkins Freeman, and it was directed by Jeff Corey, who, remember, I was going to bring him up again. He was a very prolific actor. His career spanned like more than 60 years, some like crazy amount of time like that. And he actually starred in The Dead Man, as previously mentioned. So this one, it's kind of like less creepy than the first story, but it's still like a pretty good time. So there's 3 siblings. You got Steven, who's kind of this cruel, dickish motherfucker. You got Anne, who's kind of like the reasonable, kind of stoic one. And then you have Rebecca, who's kind of naive, childlike. I don't know if I'd go so far as say like happy-go-lucky, but she's just kind of like optimistic, like, oh, let's make the best of everything, like that kind of thing. So these 3 siblings live in the family mansion, and they take care of their dying sister, Emma, who's actually played by Agnes Moorehead, who's very, very famous. But Emma has been pretty much sickly like all her life. Now, Steven, who, like I said, is just hateful, bitter motherfucker, he kind of resents this burden the most, I guess, because he's the one that gets stuck reading Emma's, beloved Dickens novels to her, like for hours and hours each day. Probably the main source of his annoyance, though, is that Emma got the entire family fortune after their father died. And so the 3 other siblings have basically like had to live off of her largesse like ever since. I mean, they take care of her, obviously. They're not just like laying around doing nothing, but yeah. Now, Anne and Rebecca, I mean, seem to be okay with this. They seem to have like some grace about the situation, and they love their sister, and they're like, what, we said we'd take care of her. She gets all the money. It's like, you know what I mean? It's all working out. So yeah, so they like it, and I love it because Anne is really like throwing some fucking shade at Steven about his constant like pissing and moaning. But Steven, though, is very openly wishing for Emma to like hurry up and drop dead already so that the remaining 3 siblings can split up the money and he can presumably get the hell out of this gloomy old house and go who knows where. I don't know. Vegas. So luckily for him, Emma, obligingly, does die soon after. Although it's made pretty obvious that Steven, who is a doctor, by the way, has decided to kind of speed the process along by straight up poisoning her. You know what I mean? Like, I guess he does it over a little while, so it's not quite so obvious, but yeah. Steven, I mean, as soon as the woman's dead, he just immediately, like, calls up the meat wagon, like, come get the body, and then he starts making an inventory of like everything in the house, like divvying up all the antiques and shit like that. He's like, yeah, I'm just gonna sell my whole entire share and get the fuck away from here. You know what I mean? So it's like he doesn't even wait 5 minutes. But of course, Emma is gonna have her final say, even though she's dead as a doornail. So in the downstairs parlor, like this shadow appears on the wall that is very obviously a representation of Emma, like sitting up in her bed, like it's her profile. Now, Steven at first tries to downplay this whole thing, like first thinking, oh, well, maybe it's like an actual weird shadow that's just caused by a trick of the light. So he like moves lamps around and moves furniture around and shit like that, like trying to get it to go away. And of course it doesn't. And then he's like, then he pivots to thinking, well, maybe it's just like a weird stain and I just need to like paint over it. So like he paints over it, but of course it doesn't work. You know what I mean? Because it's a ghost, y'all. You know what I mean? And the other 2 sisters, they seem to have immediately accepted that this manifestation is paranormal, and they're totally fine with it. So they are basically trying to tell Steven, they're like, bro, that Emma's ghost is trying to, like, communicate with us and trying to get back at you, so nothing you do is going to make any difference. But Steven is just, like, not having it. Now, because the sisters are very certain that Steven had something to do with Emma's death, and to be fair, he wasn't exactly being sneaky about it, was he? They decide that, they're going to make the punishment fit the crime. So Rebecca straight up poisons his tea. And, honestly, dude had it coming. Like, nobody's sad about it. So yeah, he keels over as well, like pretty much immediately. And Anna and Rebecca just kind of settle into the parlor with their knitting and everything. And Emma's shadow is still on the wall, but now it's joined by the shadow of their recently deceased brother, Stephen, and he's reading to her, like from an open book. So he's like stuck doing that for eternity now, that's nice. So, you know, family's all together again, and Anna and Rebecca are all like content about it. So this was another one. This was a pretty solid episode. I think this one was made all the more satisfying because of Stephen, who was just like this loathsome creature. You know, and he getting his just desserts at the end, like particularly like, at the hands of his sisters, which I thought was cool. Now, incidentally, I actually read the original story that this was based on, which I found for free online. And in the original story, it's actually, I think there's more siblings, but it was actually a brother named Edward who was killed by his older brother, whose name was Henry. So it wasn't a sister, but it was similar, like in most other ways. So episode 4. The first story is called Make Me Laugh. And this was another installment that was kind of more like a Twilight Zone style morality tale than a horror story. Now, Make Me Laugh was, again, penned by Rod Serling and directed by none other than Steven Spielberg. Yes, you heard that right. And this one is it's basically a variation on the careful what you wish for trope with a much more specific codicil about, like, when you're offered a wish, like, be very, very cautious about how you word it. Now, actual successful comedian Godfrey Cambridge actually plays a failing comedian in this one whose name is Jackie Slater. And man, they show like part of his act at the beginning, and it's like, I know that they deliberately like made it bad, but I was just kind of like, holy crap, it's like incoherent, you know what I mean? And everybody's just like sitting there in the comedy club, like looking at him like, die, motherfucker, you know what I mean? It's like so funny. But yeah, so the manager of the club that he's performing in, who's played by Grandpa Munster himself, matter of fact, Al Lewis, which is hilarious, he basically tells Jackie, he's like, you know, get the fuck out of here with your unfunny ass. Now, Jackie's kindly agent, who's actually played by Tom Bosley, so there's like a lot of big stars in this one, kind of tries to raise his spirits. He's like, oh, you know, that guy, he doesn't know what's funny, and it's like things will get better and blah, blah. But then he kind of like secretly takes off to go represent a folk band or something like that, like without telling Jackie that he's leaving. So Jackie goes to a bar and is like drinking away his sorrows, and he gets approached by this very prolix fellow, let's call him that. He's very, very wordy and like the way he talks, you know what I mean? Also, he's in brown face, which, okay. And he's wearing a turban that looks like it might have kind of been cobbled together like from one of those old-fashioned, you know, those unsanitary rotating towel things they used to have in old bathrooms. Maybe that's what he was in the bathroom doing when he came out. And he just wrapped it in his head. So yeah. So this guy, I think his name is Chatterjee or something like that. And he's a supposedly Indian guru played by the very white Jackie Vernon, who you might know as the voice of Frosty the Snowman from the Rankin and Bass special. Yeah, so it's just as cringe as it sounds. So Chatterjee tells Jackie that he's actually not a very good guru, which he insists on pronouncing with emphasis on the second syllable. So he always says guru. Like, you know what I mean? Which I'm like, what the fuck are you even doing? Like, why did you make that decision? I don't know. And he also says, well, according to guru rules, which are apparently a thing that exists, all gurus have to perform at least one miracle a month or something. I don't really know what the consequences are. Like, do they have their love beads revoked? You know, their chakras realigned, or their third eye poked out? I don't know. I don't know what the consequences are. So anyway, Chatterjee only has 1 hour left in his month to perform a miracle. But the catch is that the miracle has to be performed on a willing recipient. Like, you can't just go around and going, poof, miracle. You know what I mean? It's just like somebody randomly walking down the street. I guess that's also part of the rules. So Jackie is pretty drunk, and he's pretty depressed, and he's kind of desperate. Like, he doesn't really believe any of this shit's real, but he's just like, whatever. You know what I mean? So he's kind of willing to go along with this little scheme. He's like, sure, do a miracle on me. I want to make everyone laugh. That's what he says. Why he didn't go with the far more straightforward statement, I want to be the greatest comedian who ever lived, perhaps, mystery for the ages. I'm not really sure why he didn't just say that. So because he worded it like that, I want to make everyone laugh, as you might have surmised, now every word out of his mouth causes everybody who hears him to just fucking go into wild paroxysms of laughter. So at first, this is good. Like, he becomes like the most famous comic, like, in the United States, like, practically overnight, just causing hilarity wherever he goes. Like, even when he utters jokes so fucking old, man, that like fucking Australopithecines have already heard that shit and they're like rolling their eyes at it. You know what I'm saying? Like, he doesn't even have to tell jokes, really. Like, he doesn't have to tell jokes at all. Like, he just says random shit and like people bust up laughing. So yeah, I mean, it's easy comedy and easy money. Like, he's making an okay living. But of course, Jackie kind of becomes dissatisfied because he no longer has to work for a laugh the way he used to, and that's bumming him out. However, his fame actually does bring him a kind of a welcome offer from this very prestigious filmmaker who thinks that Jackie would absolutely kill it, like, in a dramatic role. So Jackie is completely stoked. He's like, man, this is just the challenge that I've been looking for. But, of course, when he goes to the audition, everybody just, like, cracks up at him when he's trying to be serious, and he gets really disheartened. So after he leaves the audition, just, like, completely, like, fuck this, you know, fuck my life or whatever, he happens to run into Chatterjee again. And although the guru, that's how he keeps selling it. He basically tells us, well, you know, only one wish per customer, dude, which I guess is another one of those guru rules that I've heard so much about. Jackie eventually kind of like convinces him to give him another go. Now, does he say something sensible? Like, perhaps, I'd like to be the greatest dramatic actor the world has ever seen. That would be a good wish. He does not say that. Instead, he very stupidly says, well, now I just want to make everyone cry instead. Yeah. So you can kind of see where this is going to go. Now, you know, okay, so luckily, though, this state of affairs, with him trying to make everyone cry, this lasts literally like 5 seconds because Jackie gets run over by a passing car. Yes, really, that's what happens. And this old woman who's like at a flower stall, like, and sees it happen, she just like starts crying, like, at his death. I'm presuming he's dead. You know, but her crying is like maybe not so much like a result of the guru wish as her seeing a dude get like brutally run over, like, right in front of her face. It's kind of traumatic, right? She's probably crying because of that, not so much because the guru made it like that. So again, I mean, this one's kind of more on the humorous end than anything. And even though the acting is good, it's pretty obvious where it's gonna go. And besides that, I think the whole thing is kind of like infuriating because you really just kind of like want to slap Jackie because he's such a dim bulb and he just doesn't know how to like ask for something in a way that's not going to end up like biting him in the ass. You know what I mean? Also, I have to say the finale, a bit abrupt, but I was thinking, well, maybe Rod Serling just like wrote himself into a corner and said, hey, fuck it, squish him with a Buick. You know what I mean? Also known as the Prius Ex Machina method of getting out of your story if you can't think of anything. See, I could be a failed comedian too. Thank you, I'm here all week. So the next story in this episode is called Clean Kills and Other Trophies. And this is kind of like another morality type story from Rod Serling. This time it was directed by a guy named Walter Doniger, who probably best known for, I mean, he did a bunch of TV work, but he did like 64 episodes or something like that of Peyton Place. So this was another one that was kind of pretty predictable, but it kind of had a slightly more gruesome vibe to it. And the villain of the piece was really hateable, so that was really good too. It had like a little bit more of like a horror-y veneer on it. So the actor Raymond Massey plays this very cruel, arrogant, blowhard type of dude named Colonel Archie Dittman. And he's one of those like insufferable big game hunter type dudes who's just, if you go over his house, it's just he has to regale you with his self-aggrandizing tales of his dominion over the animal kingdom, you know what I mean? So he has like the standard issue trophy room, like with all the bears and the deer heads and all that kind of stuff in it. You know, standard issue disdain of anything that he perceives as weakness, and also the standard issue racism, gotta say. So that last thing actually comes in the form of his treatment of his African butler. His name is Tom. And the guy calls Tom like a specimen, which that's always nice, and a savage, which again, standard issue. But he does concede, he's like, well, you know, Tom was actually able to be educated at Oxford, no less. So it's all good. But, you know, so even though Tom apparently still believes in black magic, so Implication being, oh, you can take the man out of Africa, but you can't take Africa out of the man. You know what I mean? It's that kind of shit. So the Colonel has a son named Archie Jr., who is the complete opposite of his father, it seems. He hates guns, he hates hunting, and he kind of comes across as like a more sensitive, artistic type. Possibly gay. I might be reading too much into the coding here, but maybe not. Like, you know what I mean? I'm not. I read him as gay, but I'm not really sure if that's what their intention was. Naturally, the Colonel is absolutely disgusted by his cowardly son, calling him at one point a dish of jelly consomme, which, I mean, if you're going to insult somebody like that, I guess you can be creative about it, but shit, man, that's pretty harsh. So yeah, Junior, it seems, is kind of inured to this shitty treatment by now. It's, you know, he's probably been talked like talked to like this like his whole entire life. So he just kind of lets it slide. I mean, at least so it appears. So at the beginning of the story, there's a little bit of a kerfuffle. There's a little bit of conflict or whatever, because the Colonel has decided that Junior isn't going to get a penny of inheritance until he actually goes out hunting with his dad and kills an animal on his own. Now, which seems a weird stipulation, but okay. So Junior, obviously not super enthused about this, and both Tom and the kind of sympathetic family lawyer, whose name is Jeffrey, try to talk the Colonel out of this, but, you know, nothing doing. You know, because the Colonel's whole thing is, you know, a man just ain't a man until he's blown a hole through one of his fellow mammals and mounted its head on the wall for posterity. So, you know, there's that whole thing. So during this whole confrontation about the inheritance, Junior does actually like kind of blow his stack at one point and snatches a rifle and actually almost shoots his dad with it. Like he points at it and he's going to pull the trigger. But unfortunately, Tom intervenes and takes the gun away. And the Colonel remains alive, at least for now. So then like the hunting trip ensues and a deer soon makes an appearance, like in a clearing or whatever. So Junior draws down on it, but he takes a little bit too long to shoot, which causes his completely apoplectic dad to like smack at him, which makes the shot go wild. And then it ends up like hitting the deer in the lung, which doesn't kill it right away. So the Colonel like pisses and moans about that. It's like, oh, it wasn't a clean kill. And it's like, now we'll have to track the deer for hours to finish the animal off, even though he was the one that made the shot miss in the first place by being an impatient jackhole. So there's that. So he's still kind of bitching when they get home that evening. And Tom, the butler, is just apparently just as sick of the Colonel's shit as everyone else is by this point. Because when the Colonel gets home and like goes in his trophy room, he finds the butler in there like wearing kind of ceremonial garb and like praying to his gods. Incidentally, the lawyer had asked Tom earlier, like, why the hell do you even stay here? Like, why have you stayed with this douchebag like all these years? He hates you, like, you know, and he treats you like shit. But Tom says, well, I wanted to make sure that Archie was okay, like Junior. You know, his dad was obviously not the man for that job, and he's like, I wanted to make sure that like he grew into manhood and that he was all right. So that's why he stayed. So I mean, you can probably guess what goes down. Like Tom doesn't actually kill the Colonel himself, but the gods that he prayed to, like actually, you know, they step up. They come through in the clutch. They actually kill the Colonel, like off screen. You don't see it. You just see the aftermath. You know, because they're punishing him for his disrespectful nature. Because Tom was saying earlier, he's like, you know, yeah, we kill animals too, but we kill them for food. Like, we kill them because we need to. We don't just kill them, like, to make our dick feel bigger and, like, just put him up on the wall like it's a waste or anything like that. So that ends up happening. So they kill him, and then when you go in, they go in the trophy room at the end, and then the Colonel's head is, like, mounted up on the wall, like, next to the deer and stuff like that. So, you know, a bit of poetic justice. So finally, we have kind of, like, a good horror-style ending. Like, despite its predictability, you could kind of see where it was going. But, you know, a lot of the stories are kind of like that. So, yeah, this was, like, another solid episode. I mean, the Colonel was such a fucker that you were just really happy to see that he got beheaded in the end. I know it's terrible, but, you know. And I have to say, like, the character of Tom was a particular highlight. Like, because he was always conducting himself with just this unflappable dignity. Like, no matter what the Colonel said to him, he was just kind of like, yep, just kind of fucking... He didn't, like, get upset. He just... kind of, because I guess he knew what was going to end up happening. He's just like, one of these days, sweet, sweet revenge, you know what I mean? Because he was just getting, like, insulted and shit like that all the time, and he just, like, kind of sit there and took it. So, I mean, the message of this piece, pretty heavy-handed. I mean, this is Rod Serling we're talking about. A lot of his stuff did seem to be kind of, like, heavy-handed, but I didn't really mind that. So I thought this was, like, a pretty solid story, too. So episode 5. The first story is called Pamela's Voice. And this is another kind of short one, but it's also really entertaining. So this was written by Rod Serling again, and directed by a guy named Richard Benedict, who actually starred in It, The Terror from Beyond Space, which is neat. I mean, among other things, too. So the story is basically there's just two characters, featuring only, again, Gomez Addams. John Astin is in this one, and Phyllis Diller. And they play like this kind of bickering married couple. So John Astin plays this guy named Jonathan, and he's kind of chilling in his parlor alongside a coffin, which you are led to assume contains the mortal remains of his wife, Pamela, who Jonathan, you find out, pushed down the stairs due to her incessant talking and nagging and whatnot. So even though that he thinks that he's finally free of her terrible grating voice, he discovers that he's mistaken when she starts suddenly yapping at him again, like all disembodied like. Now, moments after that, she actually appears like as a spirit and starts giving Jonathan a real tongue lashing about that whole shoving me down the staircase situation. She's not happy about it. Now, she ends up very smugly revealing to Jonathan that I got to go to heaven after I died, and in heaven I can do whatever the fuck I want to. And what I want to do is torment you like 24/7, and I'm just gonna like fucking talk because you didn't like me talking and you pushed me down the stairs for it, and now I'm a fucking ghost and I can just like talk to you all the time and you will never be rid of me. Honestly, I find I can't really blame her for that because he did like kill her in cold blood after all, so you know. Now, at first, Jonathan believes that he's actually just like hallucinating his dead wife because he's guilty about it. So he's like, okay, well, all I have to do is, you know, like stop thinking about it or like stop feeling guilty and I'll stop seeing things and everything will just be copacetic. However, it sucks to be him because Pamela points out to him that it's like, hey, you see that coffin in the room there? That's not my body in there. I died months and months ago. It's actually Jonathan's body in there. Turns out that he recently died due to all the excessive drinking and partying and whoring around that he was doing after Pamela died. So yeah, Jonathan is in hell, which means that Pamela can now talk to him forever. So yeah, this was a pretty fun story. Had great performances. It's a particular blast seeing John Astin playing against type because he's kind of playing like a murderous douchebag in this one rather than, because he usually plays kind of like lovable eccentrics kind of characters. So it was kind of cool like to see him like playing a bad guy. And Phyllis Diller, she's always a delight to watch. I mean, she looked like she was just having the time of her life with this fucking role, like as this kind of nagging harridan, and she just like really plays it to the hilt. So again, this was like more comedic than scary, but it had like a really good like streak of black humor to it and like some great dialogue. Like I really like the dialogue, so I can't be too mad about it. So the next story is called Lone Survivor, and this was another one that was written by Rod Serling, who actually repurposed one of his Twilight Zone stories, which was called Judgment Night, with slight variations for this one. So this one was directed by Eugene Levitt. Now, John Colicos, I think is how you pronounce the actor's name. I actually recognized him from The Changeling, and I think he played Kor in Star Trek. He plays this kind of nameless, I don't think they ever give him a name, but he's like this nameless dude, and he's found adrift in a lifeboat by the crew of a ship that's like out in the middle of the ocean. Now, the year this is set is 1915. But, bizarrely, the lifeboat has the name Titanic on it, which either means somebody is playing a very tasteless joke on the crew of the ship, or this guy has been floating around in the open ocean in a lifeboat since the Titanic sank, which was in 1912. Now, the dude he seems to have like a hard time explaining to the captain like what exactly is going on. And so there's like a pretty effective murder mystery element to the whole thing, like as the crew members are trying to like figure out how this man came to be here because there's no reports of any sinking ships anywhere in the area. And they're like, well, obviously he couldn't have come from the Titanic because that was 3 years ago. So what the fuck is going on? And then there's like a mid-story reveal that the rescue ship is actually the RMS Lusitania, which, for those not familiar with their seafaring history, was actually torpedoed and sunk by a German U-boat during World War I. And it resulted in the deaths of over 1,200 people that were on the ship. So it turns out that the lone survivor, and that's what we're going to call him because I don't think they give him a name, was actually present at the sinking of the Titanic 3 years earlier. But because he put on a dress and tried to pass for a woman, like to get to the lifeboats first, and because he actually ended up like kind of shoving some people out of the way, like to get there, he's like, yeah, I'm saving my ass for you people. So he was like that. So because he did that, like he's now condemned to relive his horrible experience like all throughout eternity. So he calls himself a human version of the Flying Dutchman. So he explains that he's in his own personal hell. So he's basically just like trapped on a life, because I'm presuming he's like dead or he's like in some kind of purgatorial or whatever. So he's like trapped on a lifeboat until some other ship happens to come by and pick him up, but his curse is that the ship that picks him up is always one that's doomed. You know what I mean? And because he knows that the ship that picks him up is always on the cusp of disaster, he always tries to warn the crew of the danger that they're in. But then there's also kind of like a Cassandra aspect to the curse as well, because it's also fated that no one will believe him and it'll just happen anyway. So just as expected, the man vainly tries to tell the captain, it's like, you guys are going to be hit by a German torpedo. But of course, everybody just thinks he's nuts. You know what I mean? They don't believe him. So he even like desperately runs out on the deck, and he even sees like the periscope of the approaching submarine that's going to attack them. But, you know, as much as he yells and everybody's just like, whatever, he's just like crazy and they don't see it or whatever. So the Lusitania goes down, and the crew realize then that they've kind of been nothing but phantoms, like in this man's recurring nightmare, like the whole time. And then there's like a little bit of an end coda, I guess, and it shows the crew of like another kind of more modern looking ship, and they kind of spot the, you know, the telltale same lifeboat like through their binoculars and start approaching it like to rescue the dude. Now, because I'm a nerd who apparently knew more about sunken ships than even I realized, I said aloud, what ship is this? The Andrea Doria? Like I was making a joke. And yep, I called it. I called it. So it was the Andrea Doria. Now, so for those unaware, the SS Andrea Doria sank in 1956 after colliding with another ocean liner, which was called the Stockholm. And that happened off the coast of Nantucket in Massachusetts. Now, amazingly, I had forgotten all about this, but there were actually only, it's still a lot, but there were only 46 casualties. Like, I think 1,660 of the 1,706 passengers were actually successfully rescued, which is pretty amazing. Now, I actually can't remember the original Twilight Zone version of this story. It was pretty similar. It had like a similar premise, but I mean, this is just like inherently a great premise. I mean, the setup is eerie and weird. Like, you know, oh my God, we found this dude in a boat like out in the middle of the ocean. There's no way he could be here, and it's from a ship that sank 3 years ago. I mean, that's a great setup. And you know, the mystery just keeps like getting deeper as kind of the tale unfolds, you know what I mean? And I think like John Colicos, the actor, he was like great as the tormented survivor. And so like the whole thing had this real kind of eerie, spooky, I like kind of like those kind of ghost ship kind of stories. So this one like really kind of like vibed with me, I think. So the next story is called The Doll. And this was actually based on a story by the legendary horror writer Algernon Blackwood. And this was directed by Rudy Dorn. So this one was another one that was like pretty horror-y, like very refreshingly creepy, even though it kind of, it deals with kind of a careworn trope, I guess, which is, you know, haunted doll. No, I mean, in all fairness though, I feel like the haunted doll thing wasn't quite so tired, maybe like back when the original Algernon Blackwood story was written, which was like back in the 1940s. So John Williams, you know, not the composer, but the actor, he plays a British colonel whose name is Himber Masters. I think it's Himber. And he's been stationed in some like kind of backwater in India, because this was during the colonial period, you know, for many years. So he arrives back home for, I don't know if he's home for, you know, permanently or if he's just like on leave or whatever. But he comes home and he's kind of like trying to reconnect with his young niece, who is also his ward because her parents, she's orphaned, and her name is Monica. Now, the problem is Monica is now in possession of this terrifying looking doll that she just carries around everywhere. Now, the governess, whose name is Miss Danton, she tells the colonel that the girl is just completely obsessed with this fucking thing, which is hideous, and she's really kind of starting to worry about it. So the colonel kind of says to Miss Danton, she's like, why didn't you take the doll away, like, as soon as it showed up? Because that's, like, some creepy shit, right? But Miss Danton said, well, I didn't because I thought you sent it, like, as a gift. Just like, it came in a box that was postmarked with the area of India that you were stationed in. So we just assumed it was from you, so that's why I didn't take it away. Now, the colonel's like, no, it absolutely was not for me. But it seems pretty clear that he knows maybe who sent this and like, where this doll might have come from. And he's being a little bit cagey about it. But he basically just tells Miss Stanton, well, we just have to get the doll away from Monica somehow, like implying that maybe it's dangerous. And Miss Stanton had said that too. She's like, I just get like a bad vibe off that doll. She's like, I think there's something wrong with it. So the Colonel actually offers to get the kid like another much nicer doll, but Monica just is not having it. She's like, no, I'm actually quite fond of this one. She's like, it even talks to me. And you're just like, uh-oh, that's never good. Now the Colonel buys her a pretty new doll anyway, but Monica kind of attempts to return it to him. She's like, oh, my original doll doesn't like it. You know what I mean? Which again, red flag. Now the ugly doll apparently later tears the new doll like into pieces, like when Monica tries to take it back because she feels bad. Now, it soon comes to light that the doll was actually not sent to Monica at all. It was sent to the house, and it was sent to the Colonel. And it was revenge for an execution that he ordered while he was in India. So the executed man's brother, whose name is Pandit Chola, who is, again, played not by an Indian actor, but by Henry Silva, who is actually half Sicilian Spanish. So he at least kind of looks brown, but you know what I mean. So he shows up and he explains that the doll is essentially like an indestructible vessel for the spirit of vengeance, you know what I mean? And it'll kind of continue to do its thing until the Colonel is dead. So like you can't destroy it until it does its thing. Now, although the doll eventually does succeed in its mission and is able to be destroyed thereafter, the Colonel actually ends up getting the last laugh because he ends up like putting his own likeness into his own cursed doll, like that looks like him, and then he sends that to Pandit. Like at the end, like Pandit opens it and goes, "Oh shit," you know what I mean? So it's that kind of thing. I was like, "What did you think was gonna happen, you dipshit?" But yeah, this was also like a pretty great story. It's somewhat similar to another Twilight Zone episode, which was called Living Doll, which is kind of like one of the more famous ones. Even though in that one the doll was like cute and normal, whereas this one the doll is not cute. I mean, yeah, like the evil doll in this is legitimately scary looking. And there are like some fantastic, like really quick shots of her creepy ass face that were like really chilling. I mean, there was one shot where they kind of panned over to the face real quick and it was making a weird expression. And I was like, it was really good. Even the Colonel doll at the end was just real unsettling looking because he moved, like it's animated, like his mouth open, like he's did this creepy smile. And I was like, oh, that's great. It would look really good. So I'm going to say like kudos to the prop department or whoever like designed the puppets here because the puppet work here is like really, really solid. They're super creepy. So yeah, this was another like really good episode all around. So episode 6, which was the last episode of season 1. So this one had 2 stories, and the first one was called They're Tearing Down Tim Riley's Bar. Now this one was written by Rod Serling and directed by Don Taylor, who also did Stalag 17, Escape from the Planet of the Apes, like a bunch of other stuff. So this story was actually nominated for an Emmy in 1971 for Outstanding Single Program. And I feel like it's certainly one of the most lauded and fondly remembered installments of the series. And while I will concede that it is an excellent dramatic presentation, and it has like stellar acting performances in it, it's definitely not horror. In fact, it falls into a particular subgenre that I'm not really sure has a name. Maybe this is uncharitable of me, but I actually kind of call it boomer nostalgia porn. You know what I mean? It's kind of not necessarily as treacly as something like Forrest Gump, but like along those lines. Like these types of narratives that sort of revolve. I kind of feel like maybe something like, what was that book by Jack Finney that was about the guy that wanted to go back to the past time and again? Was that what that was called? But there have been some Twilight Zone episodes like that too about a guy that wanted to go back in time or whatever. So yeah, so like the types of narratives that revolve around like a middle-aged man who's kind of afraid that his best days are behind him, and he's kind of getting ever more maudlin about the fact that he's like becoming obsolete type of thing. And so he kind of starts longing to return to the quote unquote simpler days of his youth, you know, which is usually like the 1940s or 1950s. It's like, oh, you know, back in the good old days when everybody was nice and friendly and wholesome and life wasn't quite so fast paced or complicated or impersonal or whatever. I have to admit, I'm not usually a fan of these kinds of stories. They kind of strike me as a little bit pointless and kind of reactionary. You know what I mean? Because it's kind of like, trying to harken back to some idealized past that never really existed. I'm going to say at least this story, they're tearing down Tim Riley's bar. It does seem to recognize this and does seem to criticize it like very gently. To some degree, although I will say that it also does sympathize with the main character's point of view. So it's kind of like striking a sort of a balance there. So William Wyndham is in this, and he plays a character named Randy Lane, who is a 48-year-old like plastics salesman. And he's worked for this firm where he's worked for 25 years, and he's just put in excellent work all that time. But just lately, he seems to be having some kind of crisis, like a midlife type of crisis. So the firm has hired this kind of up-and-coming salesman who is just demolishing Randy's numbers and also seems to relish being just like a total cunt, like to Randy all the time. The younger salesman, by the way, is played by Bert Convy, who I mostly recognize as a game show host. He did a bunch of game shows, but I specifically remember him from Win, Lose, or Draw. Remember that one? But yeah, so he's in this. Also, Randy has never really gotten over the death of his beloved wife from pneumonia, which was some time before. It was like many years before. And also guilty about the fact that he was working or he wasn't there for her, like when she died unexpectedly, and like the neighbors had to be there when she died, you know what I mean? And then, as if the universe is just trying to like twist the knife in like that much more, Randy's favorite watering hole, Tim Riley's bar, has closed and is slated for demolition. And they're going to build like this big new office building there with all the big fancy bank of elevators and a big parking garage and all that other kind of stuff. So, you know, progress, and Randy's not having it. So all of Randy's best memories, like him and his wife's first date, like his welcome home party when he came home from World War II, like, you know, he had all of them in this bar. So he's starting to feel like the world is just leaving him behind, or actually like elbowing him off is how he puts it later on. So because of this, he's actually taken to drinking rather a lot, generally during work hours, taking long lunches, you know what I mean? 3, 4, 5 martini lunches, you know how that goes. And that, you know, all of the drinking doesn't really do much to bolster his flagging sales numbers or endear him to his boss, who is kind of getting sick of this shit by now. Now, one person who does seem to have just endless wells of sympathy and warm feelings for Randy is his secretary and also his friend, whose name is Lynn. And she's played by Diane Baker, who I immediately recognized as Senator Ruth Martin from Silence of the Lambs. Now, she does everything but like straight up ask him out. You know, hey, you know, I've got these steaks in my freezer and it's too much for one person and blah, blah, blah. Like, she's like inviting him over to the house, you know what I mean? But, you know, Randy is like too depressed to really return her various obvious affections, so he kind of like shoots her down. So the bulk of the story is basically Randy just kind of slowly getting drunker and more bummed out, while he also begins having kind of like realistic flashbacks / hallucinations of happier times, like revolving around Tim Riley's. Now, after one particular bender, he actually breaks into the bar, like to have a drink. But luckily for him, like, he doesn't get in trouble at first because he has a friend, like, on the police force who's very understanding. And so he's there to kind of, like, bail him out and, like, get the other cops to leave him alone. However, eventually he keeps doing this shit. So, like, his shenanigans eventually end up with him in the drunk tank. And he gets fired, like, after his boss finds out about that. Now, at this point, because I had seen this before and I remembered the title, I thought I remembered that this story had a real dark ending, because it does seem at first like it's gonna go that way. Like, Randy leaves the office, like, after he gets fired, like, real dejected, and he says goodbye to Lynn in a way that sounds final, because you're like, oh man, this dude's gonna, like, top himself, you know what I mean? And then, like, he sneaks into Tim Riley's right before the wrecking ball is gonna, you know, wreck it. You know what I'm saying? So you're kind of thinking, oh my God, like, Randy's gonna let himself be crushed under the masonry of his favorite bar, like, you know, and the metaphor being like, oh, he's going to be buried, like, along with his romanticized past kind of thing. But no, that's not really how it ends, even though it does seem like it's going in that direction. And I mean, don't take this the wrong way, but I kind of wish that it had ended like that, because not because I didn't like or sympathize with Randy's character, because I did, like, he was a very sympathetic character, but because I thought it made more sense, like, with the narrative arc of the tale, like, as it had been going thus far. But what ends up happening is that Randy actually wanders out of Tim Riley's in slow motion, and then he overhears a bunch of people singing For He's a Jolly Good Fellow, like in a bar or restaurant type thing, like across the street from Tim Riley's. So he goes in there and he finds like all of his work colleagues having a surprise party for him. Because earlier on, Lynn had gone to their boss and like read him the riot act and basically like guilted him into actually acknowledging and like appreciating all of the work that Randy had done over the past like fucking quarter century that he'd been working there. Instead of, it's like, you know, why don't you just appreciate it instead of throwing him away like yesterday's trash? You didn't even give him a gold watch or anything like that. You were just like, yeah, you're fired, get the fuck out of here. You know what I mean? So I guess that she heard like talking to the boss like that, like, was like, oh, okay, I guess so. Because he did look like he was like, oh yeah, no, I feel kind of bad. So now they have a party. So Randy goes in the party, you know, and this smile starts slowly dawning on his face. Lynn kisses him on the cheek. And then the scene keeps cutting back from that to like the wrecking ball in slow motion, like getting closer and closer to Tim Riley's. And at the end, it like hits Tim Riley's and like fucks the sign up. And then like it, you know, there's freeze frames. Now, I suppose that you could argue, if you wanted to, that because of all of the setup about the hallucinations that Randy had been having, like throughout the story, that the surprise party is a hallucination too, and that he's just seeing that as he dies, like under the wreckage of his bar, you know what I mean? So since I'm cynical and I kind of wanted this to have a sad ending, because I'm kind of an asshole like that, I think that's how I'm going to read it, because it did seem a little bit surreal, like especially because of this kind of weird intercut slow motion way that the final sequence is shot. It was almost kind of like dreamlike. So I was like, maybe and it did seem like a little too pat and like a little too perfect. So I was kind of like, maybe that's just like his last hallucination. And he's like, oh, finally everybody loves me, you know, right before like all the fucking bricks fall on him or whatever. So that's, maybe you could read it either way, I guess. They just leave it ambiguous. But I mean, I don't know. Like, in all honesty, I kind of feel like the last scene was probably intended to be as straightforward as it appeared. So it kind of led me to believe that the point of the story was, one, that yes, like older folks obviously should absolutely be appreciated for their contributions and you could like cut them some slack. But also, two, it was also kind of gently saying that maybe older people have to be careful not to lose themselves so much in the good old days and like all these, you know, golden tinted memories that they have, you know, to such a degree that they don't appreciate the good stuff going on in their lives right now. Like, such as Lynn's very obvious love for Randy that he mostly seemed to like ignore or blow off. You know what I'm saying? I think that was kind of like a thing there. I mean, that's fair enough. But I mean, hell, it's okay. I was like thinking about this when I was watching this episode. Randy's character in this isn't even that old. Like, he says he's 48. But I mean, he talked like he was fucking inches from the grave, dude. And I mean, maybe he would have been, like, maybe back in 19... I know they didn't live as long and shit like that because... and especially him, because he didn't have, like, a super healthy lifestyle. But I mean, shit, I'm a couple years older than that, and I'm still doing all kind of fun stuff. So I don't really get this kind of, like, poor me, I'm so old, like the world is moving on without me kind of thing. I mean, I don't know. Maybe it's generational. Like, maybe it comes because I'm Gen X and this is more like a boomer thing. But it's like, I think that it kind of like came from an era where men largely defined themselves by their jobs. And then, like, after they retired, I think they tended to feel like they had outlived their usefulness, like they didn't have anything else to contribute. So maybe that's what it is. But like I said, I don't feel that way. And it's like, I don't really get that. But there's like a whole subgenre of fiction, like exploring that very feeling, which I think is, I don't like it, but it's like, it's kind of interesting to me. Regardless. But yeah, I don't like that whole, it's like, oh, I'm too old to like do anything. I'm like, fuck that. That's a very defeatist attitude. Especially nowadays. Like, I kind of feel like people aren't aging the same way. And it's like, you could be 50, you could be 60, you could just get out there and have a good time. It's like, don't feel like, oh my God, I'm 48, like my life is over. It's like, holy shit, man. It's like you have like millions of years, not millions of years, but you know what I mean. I'm exaggerating. But yeah, you can still go out and do all sorts of stuff. Like, nothing's stopping you. So yeah, I mean, this one was kind of like schmaltzy for me, but I mean, otherwise excellent, like as far as script and acting was concerned. But like I said, just don't expect a horror story because there's like absolutely nothing scary or dark about this one at all. Although you could argue that it was like a much darker story if you wanted to read it in the way that it's like that last surprise party was a hallucination too, that's what I'm gonna go with. Whether they intended that or not, I don't know, but that's my headcanon anyway. So the second story is called The Last Laurel. Now, this story, which was the last story of season 1, Pretty insignificant, I have to say. It was kind of, bleh. It just kind of had like this sort of like why bother energy about it. I guess because the first story was so long. Because like these episodes, I think, are like 48, 50 minutes. And like the first, the Tim Riley's bar story was like 40 something minutes. So like this one was like less than 10 minutes long. So it kind of just felt like it was thrown together to just kind of like fill out the episode's runtime. You know what I'm saying? And that's kind of a shame because I actually really liked the concept of this, but they're really, because it was so short, they didn't really have any room for character development or like a deeper exploration of like the paranormal phenomena like at the heart of the story or anything like that. So this teleplay, again, written by Rod Serling, and he adapted it from a novel called The Horsehair Trunk by Davis Grubb. He actually, fun fact, wrote the novel on which the excellent 1955 film Night of the Hunter was based on, so there's that. And this was directed by a guy named Daryl Duke. So we meet a dude named Marius Davis, and he used to be, I think he says he was some kind of like elite athlete or something. I can't remember like what sport it was, but it was like some kind of elite athlete. And then he was in an accident, and it basically like rendered his legs immobile, so he's, a paraplegic. So he's basically confined to his bed now, and he's very clearly bitter about the shit hand that life has dealt him. Now, the brunt of his ire seems to be directed at his wife, Susan, and his personal physician, whose name is Dr. Armstrong, and he's convinced that the two of them are having an affair. Now, the story actually never makes it clear if that is indeed the case, or if Marius is just being paranoid. It's implied that it's the latter, because Susan tells the doctor at one point, she's like, oh my god, Marius at one point, he also thought I was fucking like a member of the household staff, like the gardener or some shit like that, and she's meant to imply that she wasn't really, so I'm guessing it's just like paranoia. Now, Marius can't move from his bed, but he has apparently been able to figure out a way to kind of work around this. So he can essentially like astrally project like out of his body. Now, his projected form, as it happens, can still interact with objects just like a physical body would. So Marius decides that he's going to take revenge on his faithless wife and or the doctor. I can't actually remember like which one of them he was targeting. Maybe both. I'm not really sure. He's like, so I can pop out my body and like take revenge on them, and I will have the perfect alibi for the murder because I can't actually walk at all. So I'll just like lay there in bed and go, who, me? So Martin's soul, or whatever you want to call it, like his ghost or whatever, like pops out his body and kind of starts stumbling around, which probably he should have practiced more like before he was going the whole murder route. But it's just, constructive criticism, that's all. So he like picks up this kind of like heavy candlestick, and he's gonna bash in either the doctor's wife's or his doctor's head or his wife's head. I don't really remember which one. But in the course of doing this, like there's a storm outside, and it knocks out the power for a minute, and his clumsy ghost ass like kind of becomes disoriented in the darkness, which, like I said, I don't know why he didn't practice this, but okay. So the long and short of it is that he actually ends up busting open his own skull with the candlestick after kind of stupidly staggering into the wrong room. So now he doesn't even have a crippled body to go back to, which, serves him right, really. But like I said, practice. You got to practice that ghost shit before you go to him. And it's his own house. You'd think that he'd be like familiar enough. It's like, oh, I ended up back in the same room again. I mean, that seemed really easy to avoid. I'm just saying. So as I mentioned, because this story was so short and so like abrupt, we really learn next to nothing about any of the characters. Like, what was Marius like before the accident? Like, what was his relationship with his wife like previously? Like, did his wife really sleep around, giving him reason to be suspicious? Or was he just, so bitter that it was like poisoning his mind and making him paranoid? And the biggest thing too, like, how on earth did Marius learn to project his consciousness like out his body? I would have really liked to see a bit more backstory about that. Like, it didn't need to be over explained because I don't like that either, but something more than, oh, by the way, he can do this amazing thing. I mean, that would have been nice. That, like, I don't know, just throw in like an explanation, like how he learned to do it. Yeah, I studied with that Indian guru from Make Me Laugh. He showed me how to do it. Like, just anything like that. But they just said, oh, by the way, I can do this. That was pretty much it. Also, gotta say, the ghosty special effects, not all that great, even for the time. So they end up kind of looking comical, like, rather than spooky. Like, and I admit that at first, it wasn't even clear to me that Marius's astral self was, like, confused about where he was and, like, stumbling around in the hall. Like, I didn't get that. Like, the way that it was shot was so muddled that I was just like, well, what the fuck is going on? Like, he looks like he's in another dimension or something like that. Like, he was, because just the opticals didn't like match up or whatever. So I didn't even get that he was like, oh no, like I got disoriented and then I went back in the same room again. You know what I mean? I didn't get it until I was like, oh, all right. Yeah, it was like that. So, I mean, this was a cool concept for sure, but it needed way more fleshing out, and, you know, significantly less like silly optical effects would have been good. Okay, Night Gallery, 1 season down, 2 more seasons to go. So, you know, stay tuned for whenever I get around to discussing those, because I still got to do another season of Thriller as well, so that'll take a while. But yeah, so hopefully you guys have enjoyed this very, very long video. I really enjoyed revisiting all of these. So until next time, please remember to like and share and subscribe and comment. That would be nice too. And I'll see you guys again on the next one. Bye.